There are towns that remember a gunshot for 50 years and forget a kindness before supper. But once in a while, a choice is made so plainly, in front of so many witnesses, that even the hardest people cannot pretend they did not see it. This happened in Wyoming Territory in the spring of 1880, when the snow still held to the northern gullies and the wind came down from the mountains, sharp enough to find every crack in a man's coat. It began with 7 men walking away from Jane Hale. The seventh was Silas Bell, a broad-backed widower who owned 200 acres south of Bitter Creek and had spent the morning telling everyone he needed a sensible wife. He stood before Jane in the Crooked Pine courthouse, twisting his hat between thick hands. Behind him, 6 other bachelors had already crossed the plank floor and taken their places against the far wall. Their boots had made a slow procession of retreat. Jane remained beside the judge's desk with her shoulders straight. A carved wooden wren rested on top of her small carpet bag. Its beak had been polished, pale from years of handling. Silas looked at the 2 children standing close to Jane's skirt. 10-year-old Lottie stared back at him without blinking. Her younger brother, Abel, clutched a broken slate beneath one arm and rubbed his nose with his sleeve. "All 3?" Silas asked. Jane's jaw tightened. "They are my sister's children. I heard there was one. There are 2. And the debt? $312. A murmur traveled through the courthouse. Silas glanced toward Horace Vane, the banker, who stood near the stove with his silver watch chain stretched across his vest. Vane gave the smallest nod. Silas lowered his voice. "You might place the boy with a family that needs help." "No." "And the girl could work at the hotel." "No." Silas put on his hat. "Well," he said, no longer meeting her eyes, "a man has to know what he can carry." Then he walked away. "Before we follow them into that hard Wyoming wind, tell us where you are listening from. And if this story touches something tender in you, please like, share, and subscribe." Now let us return to Jane Hale, standing where 7 men had left her. No one spoke for several breaths. The courthouse smelled of damp wool, coal smoke, and the mud tracked in by half the town. Women from the Church Relief Committee sat in a row of chairs near the window, their gloved hands folded over their purses. Storekeeper Ezra Pike watched from the back beside barrels of lamp oil brought in as benches. 2 cowboys had come only to see whether a public marriage arrangement could provide better sport than a hanging. Horace Vane cleared his throat. "There is no disgrace in reconsidering," he said. Jane turned toward him. "I have reconsidered nothing. You have until sundown to satisfy the condition attached to your father's property. My father never attached any such condition. The loan did." Vane drew a paper from inside his coat and unfolded it with care. When Thomas Hale had borrowed against the Hale boarding house and the 6 acres behind it, he had been ill and frightened. The winter had taken most of his strength and all of his judgment. Vane's contract allowed the bank to call the debt after his death unless a new guarantor was approved. For 6 weeks Jane had scrubbed floors, rented every bed, sold pies, mended coats, and kept 2 children fed. She had paid interest but not principal. Vane had refused her as guarantor because she was unmarried and, in his words, burdened by dependents. So the church committee had found 7 men willing to consider marriage. One by one, they had asked what Jane could cook, how many dresses she owned, whether she was healthy, whether she would obey, and whether the children might be sent elsewhere. One by one Jane had answered. Now all 7 stood against the wall, relieved not to have been chosen by the woman they had rejected. Judge Carroll looked miserable behind his desk. "Miss Hale," he said, "perhaps an extension could be discussed." "With what security?" Vane asked. The room went quiet again. Then the courthouse doors opened. Wind tore through the room, lifting loose papers and sending stove smoke rolling low beneath the ceiling. A man stepped inside. Miles Jolly was known in 3 counties and welcomed in none of them. He wore a black coat whitened at the shoulders by old snow. though the day had warmed. His hat sat low over dark hair, touched with premature gray at the temples. A pale scar crossed from the corner of his left eye to the hinge of his jaw. He carried no visible rifle, but the revolver at his hip caused the two cowboys by the lamp oil to stop smiling. Some said Miles had killed 4 men. Some said 7. Some said he slept in his barn because the ghosts in his house had driven him out. The only fact everyone agreed upon was that he owned the Jolly Ranch north of Bitter Creek, paid his debts in gold, and had lived alone for 9 years. He removed his hat. His eyes moved first to Jane, then to the children, then to the 7 men along the wall. "What is this?" he asked. Vane recovered quickly. "A private legal matter." Door was open. The wind opened it. Miles looked at the hinges. Wayne has learned to turn handles. A few people lowered their heads to hide smiles. Jane did not smile. She had seen Miles jolly twice before, both times at a distance. Once when he brought an injured ranch hand to Dr. Meade in the middle of the night. Once when he dragged a drunken man away from a horse. The man was beating behind the saloon. He seemed larger indoors, not because he was especially tall, but because everyone else made room around him. Vane folded the contract. "Miss Hale requires a guarantor acceptable to the bank. The gentlemen present were considering suitable arrangements." "Marriage?" said Lottie. Jane laid a hand on the girl's shoulder. Miles' gaze settled on the child. "That's so?" All 7 said no, Lottie told him. "I did not ask them," Jane said quietly. Lottie's mouth pressed shut. Miles walked forward. His boots left dark marks on the boards. Vane watched him with unease. "Mr. Jolly, this does not concern you." "How much?" Jane answered before the banker could. $312. "Property worth?" "Near 2,000, said Judge Carroll. "More," Vane said. "If properly managed." Miles looked at him. "Then you are not worried about the debt?" "I am worried about the contract." "You are worried she might pay it before you can take the building." The room changed. It did not become louder. It became more attentive. Vane's face reddened. "Take care." Miles' expression did not move. "Been doing that all my life." He turned to Jane. She had imagined being pitied that morning. She had prepared herself for bargaining, insult, and the soft voices of women who would tell her she was brave while suggesting she give up the children. She had not prepared herself for Miles Jolly. He looked at her the way he might have studied a fence line before deciding whether it could survive another winter. Not unkindly, not tenderly, carefully. "You want the property?" he asked. "It is my home." "You want the children. They are not goods to be wanted or unwanted." Something shifted behind his eyes. "No," he said, "they are not." He looked at Abel's cracked slate and Lottie's shoes, each stuffed with paper where the leather had split. Then he faced Judge Carroll. "I will guarantee the debt." Vane laughed once. It sounded brittle. "The agreement requires a legally recognized interest." Miles glanced at the paper. "Marriage recognized." Every person in the courthouse seemed to stop breathing. Judge Carroll stood. "Mr. Jolly, you ought not speak lightly." "I do not." Jane stared at him. "You do not know me." "No, you have not asked whether I can cook." "I can cook?" A murmur ran through the room. "You have not asked whether I am obedient." "No use asking. What does not matter?" "You have not asked if I am healthy." His gaze touched the faint hollows beneath her cheekbones and the raw skin across her knuckles. "You are standing," he said. "That is enough for today." Jane felt heat rise beneath her collar. "And what would you expect in return?" The questions silenced even the wind. Miles took his time before answering. "Honesty. Workfare divided. Children not harmed. My land stays mine. Yours stays yours once the debt is paid. And a wife." His hand tightened once around the brim of his hat. "Only what she chooses to be." Silas Bell shifted against the wall. "You cannot mean to take on another man's debt. 2 half-starved young ones, and a woman proud enough to freeze before she asks for wood." Miles turned his head. The scar along his cheek whitened. "Belle," he said. "You walked away. Keep walking." Silas obeyed. One after another, the other 6 moved aside as if afraid Miles might remember their names. Jane looked at the door, the windows, the judge, and the children. She thought of the boarding house kitchen with its coal stove and nearly empty flour bin. She thought of her father, coughing into a handkerchief, while Vane placed papers before him. She thought of the 7 men, asking whether Lottie could be hired out, and whether Abel ate much. Then she looked at Miles Jolly. "Why?" she asked. His eyes met hers. "Because they made you stand alone when the room was full." It was not a declaration. It was not even an answer she fully understood. But it was simple, and it was true. Jane lifted the wooden wren from her carpet bag and held it in her palm. Her father had carved it when she was 6. Every room in which she had ever slept had known that bird upon its windowsill. She placed it back on the bag. "If Judge Carroll will put every condition in writing," she said, "I will agree." Vane stepped forward. "This is madness." Miles' gaze remained on Jane. "Likely." It took an hour to prepare the documents and less than 5 minutes to speak the vows. Jane refused the flowers offered by Mrs. Pike because they had been cut for one of the 7 men to present if he chose her. She wore her brown wool dress, shiny at the elbows. Miles stood beside her in his weather-stained coat. Lottie held Jane's hand. Abel watched Miles with frightened fascination. When Judge Carroll asked for the ring, Miles' face changed. He had forgotten one. Jane expected laughter from the back of the room. None came. Miles removed a narrow strip of rawhide from around his wrist. It was dark with age and marked with 7 small notches. "What is that?" Jane asked. "Something I should have thrown away." He tied it loosely around her ring finger. "It will do until there is better," he said. Jane studied the 7 notches but did not ask. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Miles did not kiss her. He offered his hand. Jane took it. His palm was rough and cold. They walked from the courthouse before the whole town, with Lottie and Abel behind them, and 7 rejected men watching from the wall. Outside, Wyoming spread beneath a sky the color of hammered tin. Miles had come in a 2-horse wagon loaded with salt blocks, flour, horseshoe nails, and a new iron plow point. He moved the sacks to make room beneath the canvas. Jane looked toward the boarding house across the square. "My things are there. We will collect them. I assumed we would live there until the debt was cleared. My name on the loan satisfies Vane. Your boarders can keep rooms. Mrs. Pike has a sister needing work." Jane frowned. "You arranged that?" "On the walk from the courthouse, you were beside me the entire time. I spoke to Pike while the judge searched for ink." Jane had not noticed. "I will not abandon the property. No, and I will keep the accounts. And the income will pay the debt before it pays you." "I did not ask payment." "That does not mean you will not receive it." One corner of his mouth moved, though the expression did not become a smile. "Put the bird somewhere safe," he said. The children sat beneath the canvas while Jane packed the boarding house. There was not much: 3 dresses, 2 quilts, her father's Bible, a tin of needles and buttons, Abel's slate, Lottie's rag doll, and a box of letters tied in blue ribbon. Mrs. Pike came to help. Her face was flushed with excitement. "You are the bravest woman I know," she whispered. Jane folded a patched apron. "I stood still. That can be brave. It can also be what a person does when there is nowhere to go." Mrs. Pike glanced through the doorway toward Miles, who was repairing the loose wagon brake without being asked. "People say terrible things about him. People said I trapped 7 men into coming here. You did not." "No." Jane closed the trunk. "So, perhaps people are not a reliable scripture." The Jolly Ranch lay 12 miles north, where the prairie began to rise toward dark foothills. The road crossed Bitter Creek twice and passed no other house after the Osage marker. For the first hour, no one spoke. Abel fell asleep against a flour sack. Lottie sat upright, watching Miles back. Jane smelled leather, cold iron, horse sweat, and the faint pine scent of the wood shavings caught in the wagon bed. Miles handled the reins with his left hand. The right rested near his thigh, not upon his revolver but close enough to reach it. At the second creek crossing, one wheel sank deep in mud. Miles climbed down. "Stay in the wagon." Jane climbed down after him. He looked at her shoes. "Water is cold. S.O. is waiting." Together they unloaded the flour and salt blocks. Miles cut branches from a willow bank and shoved them beneath the wheel. Jane gathered stones, sinking ankle-deep in mud. Lottie climbed down to carry the horseshoe nails. Abel woke and began to cry, because everyone had disappeared from beneath the canvas. Jane returned to lift him. Miles leaned his shoulder against the wheel. "Now," he called. Jane snapped the reins while he pushed. Mud sprayed his coat and face. The wheel rose, dropped, then climbed onto the stones. For one strange moment, Jane saw him laugh. It was only a breath of sound, surprised out of him, when the wagon lurched and threw him backward into the creek. He sat in brown water, hat gone, black hair hanging across his forehead. Lottie covered her mouth. Abel stared. Jane stepped down from the wagon and held out a hand. Miles looked at it. Then he took it. He was too heavy for her to pull, but he rose anyway, letting her believe she had helped. At the ranch, a gray house stood behind a line of cottonwoods bent east by years of wind. The barn was large and sound. The fences were straight. The corrals were clean. Everything outside showed discipline. Everything inside showed absence. Dust lay on the parlor furniture. A dead fly rested in the wash basin. The kitchen held one chair, one plate, one cup, and a skillet blackened by long use. A faded curtain hung at only one window. The other had been covered with sacking. Abel whispered, "Does a ghost live here?" Miles set the flour down. "No, did one used to?" Miles looked toward the dark hall. "My bay." Jane heard the answer but did not ask about it. She moved through the rooms. The children could share the room nearest the kitchen. She could take the small room at the end of the hall. Miles' room was upstairs, though the narrow staircase looked untouched. "Where do you sleep?" she asked. "Barn loft. There are 4 bedrooms. Barn is warmer." It was plainly untrue. Jane carried the carved wren to her room. The bedstead had no mattress, only ropes stretched across the frame. A washstand stood in the corner beneath a mirror clouded at the edges. She placed the wren on the windowsill. Miles stood in the doorway. His face gave nothing away, but his eyes stayed on the bird. "My father made it," she said. "I put it in the window wherever I sleep." "Why?" "So the room knows I mean to stay." The wind pressed against the glass. Miles nodded once and walked away. That first evening, Jane found potatoes in the root cellar, onions hanging in the pantry, and a side of bacon cured hard enough to survive a siege. She made soup, though the flour had not yet been unpacked and there was no bread. Miles washed at the pump until the creek mud left his hands. He changed his coat but not his shirt. At the table, he set out 2 additional chairs from the parlor. The 4th chair had a split seat, so he repaired it while the soup boiled, weaving rawhide through the broken cane. Abel watched every movement. "Did you kill 7 men?" he asked. Jane nearly dropped the ladle. Miles pulled the rawhide tight. "No, Lottie says people say you did. People count badly. How many?" "Abel," Jane said. Miles tied off the rawhide. "Enough," he answered. They ate by lamplight. Miles finished his first bowl quickly, then stopped as if ashamed of hunger. Jane filled it again without asking. He accepted it without thanks. But the next morning she found the wood box filled to its rim. That became the beginning of their language. Jane kept coffee warm near the stove. When Miles rode the north fence, he replaced the leather soles of Lottie's shoes and left them outside the children's door. Jane washed the faded curtain and cut it in half so both kitchen windows had cloth. Miles built a second shelf for her dishes. She patched his black coat. He repaired the lock on her trunk. She never asked him why he slept in the barn. He never asked why she woke before dawn and counted the coins in her purse 3 times. The children learned the ranch carefully. Lottie fed hens and gathered eggs. She had a quick mind and a distrust of praise. Abel carried kindling, spilled milk, followed Miles too close to the horses, and apologized to chairs when he bumped them. Miles spoke to both children as if they were capable of understanding useful things. Never walk behind a horse without touching its flank. Why? Abel asked. So it knows where you are. Does it get frightened? Everything gets frightened when surprised. Jane, kneading bread at the table, looked up. Miles felt her gaze. He turned toward the tack room. By the second week, the house smelled of yeast and soap instead of dust. Jane opened the parlor windows. She beat rugs against the fence until clouds of dirt rolled toward Nebraska. In a locked cabinet, she found 6 china plates painted with green leaves, a silver-backed hairbrush, and a woman's shawl folded around a child's wooden whistle. She did not touch the shawl. That night she set one of the china plates at Miles' place. He stopped when he saw it. I found them in the cabinet. His gaze moved to the parlor door. You should use them, Jane said. No, why not? They break. All plates break. Teen does not. Jane lifted the china plate and returned it to the cabinet. The following evening, a china plate waited at her place. She did not mention it. Spring advanced slowly. Snow melted from the hills and filled the creek with brown, violent water. The prairie turned green in scattered patches. Calves came in the night, wet and trembling, while coyotes called from the ridges. Jane discovered quickly that the Jolly Ranch was prosperous only from a distance. Miles owned land and cattle, but a winter disease had taken 30 head. A roof leak had spoiled sacks of grain. 2 hired men had left before Christmas and never returned. He had been doing the work of 4 people while sleeping 3 hours a night. His books consisted of receipts shoved into a cigar box. Jane carried the box to the kitchen. What are you doing? Finding out whether you are rich or merely tired. I know which. Then the numbers will not frighten you. She spent 3 evenings sorting receipts. Miles sat across from her repairing harness, lamplight moving over his scar. You are paying Ezra Pike 12 cents more per pound for coffee than the Army post charges, she said. Post is 20 miles farther. You ride past it when you sell cattle. His needle paused. You paid the blacksmith twice for the same wagon axle. No, she held out both receipts. He studied them. Russ cannot count, he said. Russ can count your money. The next week, Miles took Jane to town. They left the children with Mrs. Weller, an older widow who lived near Bitter Creek and had known Miles since he was a boy. Jane carried her ledger. Miles carried the duplicate receipts. Blacksmith Tom Rusk repaid the money. The Army Post agreed to sell coffee, sugar, and lamp oil at contract rates if Miles supplied beef in autumn. At the bank, Horace Vane looked surprised when Jane paid $42 toward the principal. You have been married less than a month, he said. I can read numbers quickly. Vane glanced at Miles. A useful wife. Miles' face hardened. Jane put a hand lightly against his sleeve before he could speak. I am a useful person, she said. The wife is a separate matter. Vane's smile thinned. Outside, Miles stood beside the hitching rail, breathing slowly. I could have answered him, he said. I know. Why stop me? Because he wanted the town to see you angry. I was angry. He does not need to know how easily he can purchase it. Miles looked toward the bank window, then at Jane. You saw that? I've known men like Horace Vane my whole life. They mistake composure for weakness because they have never had to practice it. He helped her into the wagon. His hand remained around hers 1 second longer than necessary. Gossip followed them home. Some said Jane had bewitched Miles. Others said he had purchased her with $300. Silas Bell claimed she had always intended to choose the wealthiest man in the room. Jane heard the talk at the mercantile and kept measuring calico. Miles heard it outside the fees store. A rancher named Orrin Phelps laughed and asked whether Jane slept in the house while Miles stayed with the horses. Miles struck him once, only once. Phelps fell across a barrel and did not rise for several minutes. When Jane learned of it, she waited until the children were asleep. Miles stood at the kitchen sink with his bruised knuckles beneath cold water. "You told me everything gets frightened when surprised," she said. He shut off the pump. He was not surprised. "That improves nothing." Miles dried his hand. "He spoke your name. Many people do not that way. I survived 7 men, leaving me in a courthouse. I can survive Orrin Phelps speaking badly," he said. "I do not want to know." Miles faced the dark window. Jane set a jar of salve beside him. "You cannot strike every person who insults me." "No, do you agree?" "No, I mean, there are too many." Despite herself, Jane nearly smiled. Miles saw it in the window glass. His shoulders eased. She spread salve over his split knuckle. His hand was large and still beneath hers. "Protecting my dignity does not always require blood," she said. "What does it require?" "Sometimes it requires standing beside me while I protected myself." He turned his hand, and for an instant their palms met. "I can do that," he said. The first quiet night conversation came in May. Rain had fallen for 3 days. The roof drummed. The creek rose over the lower pasture, and Miles rode out after supper to move cattle to higher ground. He returned near midnight, soaked through, leading a limping mare. Jane met him in the barn with a lantern. "What happened?" "Wire cut. The mare's hind leg was bleeding." Jane held the lantern while Miles washed the wound. His fingers were stiff from cold, and the horse trembled each time thunder rolled across the hills. Jane set the lantern on a beam. "Give me the bandage. You know horses. My father ran a stage stop before the boarding house. I know wounds that can be stitched and wounds that must drain." Miles handed her the cloth. Together they wrapped the mare's leg. Jane spoke softly, not to calm the animal so much as to give the silence something gentle to hold. When they finished, rain hammered the roof too hard for conversation. Miles sat on an overturned bucket. Water ran from his hair to his collar. Jane brought a horse blanket and placed it around his shoulders. "You will catch fever. Do not catch from rain. You catch it from standing wet in a barn, pretending not to be cold." He pulled the blanket closed. Lightning flashed through gaps in the boards. Jane sat on a bale of hay. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Miles looked at the rawhide band tied around her finger. "You can take that off. I know. Is ugly. It is practical." His mouth moved faintly. Jane touched the 7 notches. "What do they mean?" The mare shifted in her stall. Miles looked toward the loft ladder. "My father cut one each year after my mother died." "For what?" "Years he blamed me." Jane waited. Miles rubbed a thumb across his palm. "I was 13. My mother took my little sister across the river in flood season. I was supposed to go with them. I stayed behind because my father had promised I could break a new coat." His voice remained flat, as though the story belonged to someone else. "The wagon overturned. My mother drowned. My sister too. Father said if I had been there, I might have saved one. Each year on the day they died, he cut a mark and made me wear it for 7 years, until he drank himself under a freight wagon." Jane looked at the notches. "Why keep it?" "Did not know what else to do with it. And when Judge Carroll asked for a ring, you tied it to me." His eyes closed briefly. "I did. Do you regret that?" "Yes." The single word struck harder than she expected. Then he continued, "Not the marriage, giving you something made from blame." Rain rushed from the eaves. Jane loosened the rawhide and slid it off her finger. Miles watched without moving. She took her sewing scissors from her apron pocket and cut through the strip. Then again, 7 small pieces fell into her palm. "What are you doing?" "Changing its purpose." She crossed the barn and tied 1 piece around the mare's bandage. 1 mark to remind us he was hurt and tended. She tied another to the lantern handle. One so we remember there was light. A third went around the bucket. One for water. She placed the remaining pieces in his hand. You were 13, she said. That is the only counting that matters. Miles stared at the raw. His face did not break. His voice did. My sister was 6. Jane sat beside him. For a while, they listened to the rain and the mare's breathing. Then Miles said, you should have had better than a courthouse bargain. Jane looked at the wetboards beneath their boots. So should you. That was all. But when the rain stopped near dawn, Miles walked back to the house with her. He did not climb to the loft. He slept on the parlor sofa instead. In June, the garden began. The soil behind the kitchen had gone hard from neglect. Jane turned it with a spade, while Lottie removed stones and Abel hunted worms, each discovery announced, as if he had struck silver. Miles watched from the corral. That patch floods, he said. Then help me move the ditch. I have cattle to brand. Then it will flood. He stood there another moment, caught between irritation and respect. That evening he dug the ditch. Jane planted beans, onions, carrots, squash, and 3 rows of sunflowers along the fence. Miles said flowers fed no one. They feed bees. Bees are not ours. They have not learned about property lines. By July, the sunflowers stood waist high. The house changed in small ways. Lottie began leaving books on the parlor table instead of hiding them beneath her mattress. Abel stopped asking whether ghosts lived in the hall. A second coffee cup appeared beside Miles at breakfast. Jane hung the woman's shawl from the locked cabinet over the back of a chair, not to claim it, but to let it breathe. Miles noticed. That was my mother's, he said. I guessed. You can use it. I will not without permission. You have it. Jane touched the faded wool. Thank you. He walked out before she could see what the words cost him. Miles no longer slept in the barn every night. First he used the parlor sofa during storms. Then after days, when work left him limping from an old injury. Finally Jane prepared the upstairs room, washed its walls, and opened its windows. She found a child's height marked beside the doorframe. Mara, age 4. Mara, age 5. Mara, age 6. Jane did not scrub the marks away. When Miles saw the clean room, he stopped on the threshold. You found them? Yes. You left them? Yes. He looked at her. Jane smoothed the fresh sheet across the bed. A house should not have to forget everyone it has held. That night, he slept upstairs. In the morning, he came down before sunrise and found coffee waiting. He drank it at the table while Jane shaped biscuit dough. Neither mentioned the change. The midpoint came with a letter. It arrived in late July, carried by the postwriter in a leather pouch, darkened with sweat. Jane recognized the handwriting before she broke the seal. Her younger brother, Samuel, had gone east 3 years earlier after quarreling with their father. He had not come home for the funeral. He had written only twice. The letter was brief. Samuel had heard of Thomas Hale's death and Jane's marriage. He claimed the boarding house belonged partly to him, as their father's son. He planned to return with an attorney and demand sale of the property. At the bottom, he had written that he was willing to take Lottie and Abel if Jane paid him from the proceeds. Jane read that line twice. Then she folded the letter. She did not tell Miles. For 3 days she worked harder. She weeded beneath the noon sun, canned berries until midnight, and rode to town alone to study the deed at Judge Carrow's office. Samuel did have a possible claim. Her father had died without a proper will. If the property sold, the bank debt would be paid. But Jane's independence would rest entirely upon Miles. The thought was not shameful because of anything he had done. It frightened her because she had spent years learning that every shelter offered by a man could be withdrawn. She began placing coins in a flour sack hidden beneath her mattress. She packed one dress, then another. On the 4th night, Miles found a carved wren missing from the windowsill. He stood in the doorway of her room. Jane was closing the trunk. Where are you going? Town? with a trunk. I have business. Bird is packed. Jane's hand froze on the latch. Miles entered the room but kept distance between them. What happened? Nothing you need to carry. His expression hardened. Do not use their words. Who see? The 7. Bal said a man should know what he could carry. Jane looked away. Miles saw the letter on the washstand. He did not touch it. Tell me. My brother is returning. He will claim the boarding house. I might lose it. We will fight. You guaranteed the debt, not a family lawsuit. We will fight. I will not have your ranch dragged into it. It will not be. You do not know that? No. Neither do you. She sucked the trunk. I can take work at the Cheyenne Hotel. Lottie and Abel can remain with me. The marriage can be annulled. Your name need not be damaged further. Miles' face became very still. You think that is what concerns me? I think you chose a woman in a courthouse because you could not bear to see her humiliated. That was honorable. It does not require you to surrender the rest of your life. You are not the rest of my life. Jane could not answer. He glanced toward the empty windowsill. Then he opened the trunk. Jane stepped forward. Do not. Miles lifted out the carved wren. He held it with surprising care and crossed to the window. He placed it in the evening light. Leave the bird, he said. Jane's throat tightened. Miles, leave the bird. It is not enough to say a thing twice. He faced her. No. So I will say one more. This is your home. The sentence was quiet. No promise followed it. No demand. Jane looked at the wren. Then she sat on the bed and told him about Samuel. Miles listened without interrupting. The next morning he rode to town with the letter. He returned after dark carrying copies of the deed, 3 old tax records, and a statement signed by Mrs. Pike that Jane had managed and maintained the property through her father's final illness. You were gone 14 hours, Jane said. Judge Caro keeps poor files. You did this alone? Vane helped. Horace Vane. He did not intend to. Miles had visited the bank and asked to see the original loan papers. In the attached property description, Thomas Hale had listed Jane as co-owner because she had contributed money earned from running the stage kitchen years before. Samuel's claim was weak. Jane read the line by lamplight. How did you know to look? Did not. Kept looking until something told the truth. She folded the paper carefully. Thank you. Miles stood across the table. You would have left, yes, to protect me. Do not do it again. A faint hurt sharpened her voice. You do not command me. No, he swallowed. I am asking. Jane looked at his hands resting on the chair back. All right, she said. The next day she unpacked her dresses. The bird remained in the window. Samuel arrived 2 weeks later. He came in a hired buggy wearing a cream-colored suit, unsuited to Wyoming dust. His mustache had been waxed into points, and a gold pin shone at his tie. Jane met him on the boarding house porch in town. Miles stood beside her, as he had promised. Lottie and Abel remained with Mrs. Weller. Samuel kissed the air near Jane's cheek. Sister, marriage agrees with you. Grief did not agree with father. Samuel's smile faltered. I received no notice until too late. You received 3 letters. The post is unreliable. Your answer was reliable. There was none. Samuel looked at Miles. You must be jolly. Miles jolly. I have heard stories. Most people have. Samuel turned back to Jane. This need not become unpleasant. Sell the property. We divide what remains after the bank is satisfied. No, you cannot run a boarding house from 12 miles away. I have hired Mrs. Pike's sister. The books are current. Every room is occupied. Then it should sell well. It is not for sale. Samuel sighed as if disappointed in a child. Our father intended the property to remain with his family. I am his family. I, a married woman, belongs to her husband's household. Miles shifted, but Jane touched his sleeve. Samuel noticed. "Oh, I see. He lets you speak." Jane's eyes cooled. "No one lets me speak." People had begun gathering along the boardwalk. Ezra Pike stood in his store doorway. Judge Carroll crossed the street. Even Horace Vane appeared near the bank window. Samuel lowered his voice. "You have always been stubborn. It is why no decent man wanted you." The words struck the same wound the courthouse had opened. Jane heard the 7 pairs of boots crossing the floor. She felt again the raw hide around her finger and the eyes of the town upon her. Miles stepped closer, not in front of her. Beside her, Jane drew the deed copy from her reticule. "My name appears as co-owner. You have no authority to sell." Samuel's face reddened. "Father would never. His signature is there. I will challenge it. Then Judge Carroll will hear how often I sent you money while Father was ill. He will hear how I paid the taxes. He will hear that you offered to take 2 children in exchange for proceeds from land you do not own." Samuel's gaze flicked toward the listeners. "You would shame your own brother publicly." "No," Jane said. "You did that yourself, publicly." For a moment, no one moved. Then Miles opened the boarding house door for Jane. Samuel laughed sharply. "Jolly, do you know what she is? A woman 7 men refused. A woman with debt, children, and a tongue that will cut your throat in your sleep." Miles looked down the boardwalk. Silas Bell stood outside the feed store. Orrin Phelps watched from beside the saloon. 2 of the other courthouse bachelors had gathered near the barber pole. The whole town seemed present again. Miles' hand rested near his belt, but he did not reach for his weapon. He remembered what Jane had said. Sometimes protecting dignity requires standing beside her while she protected it herself. "She is Jane Hale," he said. "That is what she is." Samuel sneered. "And what are you? Her 8th choice?" Miles looked at Jane. "No," he said. "I was hers." Jane felt something move through the crowd, quieter than surprise and deeper than gossip. Samuel left before sunset. The lawsuit never came, but the outside pressure did not end with him. In September, Horace Vane called the Jolly Ranch loan. Miles had borrowed money 2 winters earlier to replace cattle lost in a blizzard. The payment was not due until November, but Vane claimed a clause allowed early collection if the ranch's value appeared endangered. The danger, he said, was Miles' reckless assumption of Jane's debt. Jane read the notice twice at the kitchen table. "How much?" "800. What do we have?" "460 after wages." "The cattle sale, October. Can it be moved sooner? Prices are low." Jane went to the window. Sunflowers nodded beyond the glass, their faces heavy with seed. "This is punishment." "Yes, for the boarding house, for Vane being made a fool. Who can sell my property?" "No, it would clear both debts." "No, it is a building. It is yours. And the ranch is yours. And the ranch is yours." Miles' jaw tightened. "That is different." "It is not." He walked outside. Jane followed him to the barn. "You cannot decide alone. I can decide what happens to my land. And I can decide what happens to mine." He turned. "You fought your brother for it. I fought for the right to choose." Wind moved dust between them. Miles looked tired. More than tired. Afraid. "If we sell early," Jane said, "Vane will arrange buyers to force the price down. If we wait, he takes the north pasture. That pasture holds water. I know. It keeps the herd alive in dry years. I know." Fen stopped speaking as if the answer is simple. "I am speaking because silence will not produce $800. He flinched as though she had struck him. Jane regretted the sharpness but not the truth. For 2 days they spoke only of chores. Then Lottie came into the kitchen carrying Jane's account book. "Aunt Jane, what is it?" "You wrote every room rented at the boarding house, ice, and..." Mrs. Clegg sleeps in the pantry. Jane looked at her. What? Mrs. Clegg, the new manager, had rented her own bedroom to a railroad surveyor and moved a cot into the pantry. 2 travelers slept in the parlor. Men working on the telegraph line filled the attic. The building earned more in 1 month than it had earned in 3. Jane rode to town. By evening, she had arranged to lease the stable to the stage company, sell meals to the telegraph crew, and turn the unused wash-house into another room. It still would not raise $800 by the bank's deadline, but it would raise $200. Miles sold 3 horses. Jane sold her mother's silver tea service, which had remained wrapped in cloth at the bottom of her trunk. They reached $718. Vane refused an extension. Then the first snow came early. It fell on October 3rd, thick and wet, bending the sunflowers and erasing the road to town. By night, the wind turned north, temperatures dropped hard, cattle crowded the lower pasture. Miles and 2 hired hands rode out before dawn to move them toward shelter. Jane watched the white world through the kitchen window. At noon, one of the hands returned leading Miles' riderless horse. The saddle was streaked with blood. Jane did not remember putting on her coat. She remembered Lottie grabbing her arm. I am coming. No, you do not know where he is. The horse came from the east draw. I know the draw. Jane looked at the girl's pale face. Lottie was 11 now, but hunger and fear had aged her habits. She never cried when she could make herself useful. Stay with Abel, Jane said. Keep the stove lit. If we are not back by dark, go to Mrs. Weller. Jane saddled the gray mare Miles had taught her to ride. She took rope, blankets, a lantern, and the rawhide piece still tied to its handle from the night of the storm. Snow stung her eyes. The east draw lay 3 miles from the house, where the land dropped suddenly between limestone ridges. Drifts formed deep there. Jane found one of the hired men near the fence, his shoulder dislocated. He had seen Miles ride after a group of cattle trapped beyond the wash. The bank fence is down, he gasped. Wire under snow. Jane tied his arm against his chest and pointed his horse toward the ranch. Then she rode on. She found Miles at the bottom of the draw. His horse had stepped into hidden wire and thrown him against a rock. The horse had freed itself, but Miles lay half covered by blowing snow. One leg bent badly beneath him. Jane slid from the saddle. Miles, his eyes open. You came? Do not sound surprised. Did not mean to. She brushed snow from his face. Blood darkened his hair above one ear. Can you move your toes? Yes, your leg. No, that is sensible. It might be broken. Cattle bawled beyond the ridge. The storm swallowed the sound. Jane wrapped him in blankets and tied the rope around his chest. I cannot lift you onto the mare. No, I will drag you on the canvas. Snow too deep, I know. He looked toward the north, fighting to remain awake. Line shack? How far? Half mile? Jane could not see it. Miles raised one shaking hand and pointed toward a lone cottonwood. Beyond that, she tied the canvas behind the mare and rolled Miles onto it. He groaned once, then bit down on his glove. For half a mile, Jane led the mare through snow above her knees. The line shack appeared only when she was 20 yards away, a low shape nearly buried in white. The door had frozen shut. Jane struck it with a rock until the latch broke. Inside were a rusted stove, 2 bunks, dry wood, and a tin box of matches. She built fire. Miles shook violently. Jane cut away the trouser leg and found the shin swollen but not crooked. She splinted it with boards torn from the lower bunk. Night came early. Wind screamed around the shack. Jane melted snow in a coffee pot and held the cup to his mouth. He drank, then looked at the rawhide tied to the lantern. On for light, he murmured. Yes, did not think you kept it. I keep useful things. His eyes closed. Jane slapped his cheek lightly. Stay awake. Tired. I do not care. You are hard-hearted. The stove smoked. Snow hissed against the stovepipe. Jane sat on the floor beside the bunk, her back against the wall. Miles' hand hung over the edge. She took it to feel whether his fingers were warming. After a long silence, he said, "Vane wins if I die. You will remain alive out of spite. Have done worse things for worse reasons." His thumb moved against her knuckles. "Jane." "Yes, 80. The courthouse. I did not choose you because I pitied you." She looked toward the stove. "This is not the time." "Might be only time." "No," he breathed shallowly. "I chose you because you looked at 7 men leaving and did not ask one to stay. I knew what that cost." Jane's eyes burned. "You could not have known." "I did. Sleep for 10 minutes, she said. "Then I will wake you." "Thought you said stay awake." "I changed my mind." "Bossy." "Yes." His fingers tightened weakly around hers. The storm lasted until morning. When the sky cleared, Lottie arrived with Mrs. Weller, 2 ranch hands, and a sled. The girl had followed Jane's instructions exactly until dawn, then organized the rescue herself. Miles' leg was badly bruised, but not broken. He had 3 cracked ribs and a head wound that required 12 stitches. For 6 weeks he could not ride. Jane ran the ranch. She assigned pasture work, negotiated hay, kept the cattle sale from collapsing, and wrote buyers in Cheyenne rather than accept the low price offered by Vane's friends. She sold 20 head to the army at a better rate and drove them with the hired men herself. When a steer broke from the herd near the post road, Jane turned it with Miles' black gelding. The fear crawled up her throat each time the animal charged. She returned after dark with $840 in a canvas bag. Miles sat near the kitchen stove with his leg propped on a chair. "You should not have ridden the gelding," he said. "He behaved. He buys only when insulted. He bit me yesterday." "What did you say to him?" Miles stared at her. Then he laughed. It was the first time the children had heard the full sound. Abel came running from the parlor as if a window had broken. Jane placed the money on the table. "We pay Vane tomorrow." Miles looked at the bag, then at her wind-burned face and mud-stiff skirt. "You saved the north pasture." "We saved it." "You did." "Miles," he stopped. Jane removed her gloves. "I did not come here to be protected from every burden. I came because we made an agreement to divide the work fairly. You have done more than fair. So have you." She poured coffee and placed it beside him. His hand closed around the cup, but his eyes remained on her. "Jane, I am ours, and bless God." She turned toward the stove before he saw. The debt should have ended the trouble. Instead, it began the climax. Horace Vane accepted the ranch payment with a smile. Then he produced another paper. The Hale boarding house balance, he claimed, had accumulated penalties, inspection fees, and legal expenses associated with Samuel's threatened claim. The amount due was now $406, payable within 10 days. Jane stood at the bank counter. Miles leaned on a cane beside her, ribs still bound beneath his coat. "This is fraud," Jane said. "It is contract law," Vane replied. "Show me the charges." He slid the itemized list across the counter. Jane read each line. $30 for document review, $25 for correspondence with an attorney she had never hired, $48 for property risk adjustment, $50 for administrative delay. The rest was interest calculated at a rate different from the signed loan. "You altered the terms." Vane folded his hands over his vest. "I interpreted them." Miles' cane struck the floor once. Every clerk in the bank stopped writing. Vane's eyes moved toward him. "Violence will not erase a debt." Jane placed her hand over Miles' fist. "No," she said, "but evidence Vane's smile returned. "You have none." Jane looked at the clock on the wall, then at the ink bottle beside the ledger. The ink was purple. Every statement Van had sent her father had been written in black. The altered penalty schedule carried purple figures in the margins. Jane had seen the same purple ink before. On Tom Rusk's duplicate axle receipt. On the early call notice for the Jolly Ranch, on a letter Vane had sent the church committee, listing the terms under which Jane might find a husband. "You keep separate ink for private accounts," Jane said. Vane's smile faded. "I keep several inks. The purple entries are not copied into your customer receipts." "I do not understand your accusation. I think you have been adding fees after documents were signed." Miles looked at her. Jane continued, "I think you did it to Father. I think you did it to Tom Rusk's customers. I think you plan to take the boarding house for less than half its value." Vane stood. "You will leave my bank?" Jane did not move. Miles stepped beside her. Vane's voice sharpened. "Jolly, take your wife home." Miles looked through the bank window. The street outside was crowded. Word had spread that the Hale property would be seized. The 7 bachelors from the courthouse were there. So were Mrs. Pike, Judge Carroll, Ezra Pike, Tom Rusk, Orrin Phelps, and Samuel Hale, who had returned after receiving a telegram from Vane. The banker had assembled the town to witness Jane's final humiliation. Miles opened the bank door. Cold sunlight filled the room. "Come inside," he told the crowd. Vane's face went white. "This is private property." "So is Jane's house," Miles said. "You tried to take it in public." People entered. Judge Carroll came first. Mrs. Pike followed, then the storekeeper, the blacksmith, ranchers, boarders, church women, laborers from the telegraph line, and men who had once crossed the road rather than passed too close to Miles Jolly. Silas Bell remained near the door. Samuel stepped beside Vane. "This spectacle proves nothing," Samuel said. "My sister is confused by figures beyond a woman's training." Jane opened her ledger. "I kept the boarding house accounts from the age of 17. I know what a pound of flour cost in 1872, how many beds were rented during the cattle convention of 1876, and exactly how much money I sent you in St. Louis when you claimed to be ill." Samuel looked away. Jane laid Vane's statement beside the original contract. "Judge Carroll, will you compare the interest rates?" The judge did. "They differ," he said. "Will you compare the handwriting?" Carroll adjusted his spectacles. "The added figures appear to be Vane's." Vane struck the counter. "Of course they are mine. I am the banker." Tom Rusk pushed forward, carrying a packet of receipts. "He did it to me," the blacksmith said. "Mrs. Jolly showed me one mistake. I looked again. There are 6. Ezra Pike produced his own ledger. My lamp oil account too. Then Mrs. Clegg, manager of the boarding house, laid 3 rent receipts on the counter. Vane had been collecting a separate inspection charge from tenants without Jane's knowledge. The room filled with voices. Vane reached for the ledger. Miles placed his cane across the banker's wrist. He did not strike. He simply held it there. "No," he said. Sheriff Dobbins entered from the street. He read the documents, listened to Judge Carroll, and asked Vane to surrender the bank ledgers, pending investigation. Vane refused. Samuel moved toward the rear door. Lottie stood there. She had come in unnoticed with Abel and Mrs. Weller. "You said families should not shame one another publicly," Lottie told him. Samuel stopped. The girl held up an envelope. This was in Mr. Vane's coat at the boarding house. Mrs. Clegg explained that Vane had visited that morning, entered Jane's old room without permission, and left the envelope beneath the mattress. Lottie had seen him from the hall. Inside were forged documents transferring Jane's ownership share to Samuel in exchange for $100. Samuel's waxed mustache trembled. Vane began shouting that the children were thieves. That was when Miles faced the whole town. He stood without the cane. Pain tightened his mouth, but he remained upright beside Jane. Months earlier, 7 men had walked away because her debt appeared heavy, her children inconvenient, and her dignity too costly. Now those men stood among the witnesses. Miles removed his revolver. Several people gasped. He placed the weapon on the bank counter. Then he removed the deed to the Jolly Ranch from inside his coat and set it beside the gun. "If the court finds Jane owes $1 honest, he said, "sell my land to pay it." Jane turned toward him. "No," he looked at her. "This is my choice. You cannot sacrifice the ranch." "I am not sacrificing it. You place the deed on the counter. I am placing my name with yours." His voice carried through the bank. "I chose Jane Hale when 7 men walked away. I choose her now when standing with her cost everything I own. I choose Lottie and Abel. I choose the boarding house, the debts honestly owed, the work, the winter, and every mouth at our table." No one moved. Miles' eyes stayed on Jane. "I do not choose her because she needs saving. She saved my cattle, my land, those children, and the man I might still become. I choose her because there is no home I want that does not have her bird in the window." Jane's composure broke, not loudly. Her breath shook once. She reached beneath her collar and drew out the final piece of old rawhide, which she had carried on a cord around her neck. One of the 7 marks remained visible upon it. She laid it beside his deed. "That was the last piece," Miles said. "I know. What does it stand for?" Jane looked around the room where 7 men had once refused her. "Not blame," she said. "Choice." She turned to Miles. "I choose you too." Judge Carroll cleared his throat, though his own eyes had grown wet. "For the record," he said, "Mrs. Jolly owes nothing beyond the original principal and lawful interest, which her payments have nearly satisfied. The deed will not be required." Sheriff Dobbins closed the bank. Horace Vane and Samuel Hale were taken to Cheyenne for hearings. Vane was later convicted of fraud and forgery. Samuel returned east after repaying part of the money he had accepted. The town did not change in a single afternoon. Towns rarely do. Some people apologized to Jane because they were ashamed. Others apologized because public opinion had shifted, and they wished to stand on the winning side. Jane learned the difference. Silas Bow came to the ranch in November. He stood on the porch holding his hat. "I was wrong," he said. Jane waited. "I thought the children would be a burden from inside." Came the sound of Abel reciting multiplication badly, while Lottie corrected him. Miles was hammering a loose chair rung near the stove. "They were," Jane said. Silas blinked. So was the debt, so was the ranch, so was Miles' injured leg, so was I. Some days. Silas looked confused. Jane folded her arms. "A family is not made of people who are never burdens. It is made of people who carry one another without keeping score." Silas lowered his head. "I am sorry. I believe you." He left lighter than he had arrived. By Christmas, the Hale debt was paid. Jane refused to sell the boarding house. She renamed it the Wren House and placed a painted wooden bird above the door. Mrs. Clegg managed it. One room was always kept free for a woman or child needing shelter, though Jane never advertised the fact. At the ranch, Miles built a longer table. He claimed it was because the old one wobbled. Jane knew better. Mrs. Weller came for Sunday dinner. Ranch hands ate there during storms. Lottie invited a girl from town whose father drank too much. Abel brought in every hungry animal he found, including a 3-legged dog and a crow that stole buttons from Jane's sewing tin. The house became noisy. Miles sometimes stepped outside when the noise grew too large. Jane never followed immediately. She gave him time to remember that a full house was not the same as a dangerous one. Then she carried coffee to the porch. He always made room beside him. One evening in early spring, nearly a year after the courthouse wedding, Miles asked Jane to walk with him to the cottonwoods. Snowmelt shone in the fields. New calves called from the pasture. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. At the creek, he stopped. "I have something." Jane expected a tool, a receipt, or perhaps a sick animal hidden beneath his coat. Instead, he took a small box from his pocket. Inside lay a plain gold ring. Jane looked at him. "Better than rawhide," he said. "Less useful for tying a bandage, likely." She removed the cord from around her neck. The last rawhide piece lay against her palm. Miles shook his head. "Keep it. I thought you did not want blame kept." "That is not what it means now." Jane handed him the gold ring. "You put it on." His fingers were careful. The ring fit. Then Jane tied the rawhide around his wrist, not tight enough to bind, only enough to remain. Miles looked at the single notch. "One choice," she said. He lifted his hand to her cheek. This time, when he kissed her, there was no judge, no banker, no crowd, and no bargain waiting to be signed. Only creek water beneath melting ice, cattle moving through evening grass, and two people who had learned that love did not arrive complete. It was built through repaired hinges, warmed coffee, honest ledgers, muddy crossings, sleepless storms, and the stubborn decision to remain. Years passed. The sunflowers returned each summer along the garden fence. Lottie became a teacher and married a patient man who never mistook her quietness for agreement. Abel grew tall, learned horses from Miles, and developed an alarming habit of bringing strangers home for supper. The Wren house remained open long after the railroad changed the town. Travelers said its bread was the best in Wyoming. Women said no one was ever asked too many questions at the door. Miles' name was still feared in some places, but not for the reasons it had once been. Men feared cheating anyone under his protection. Bankers feared Jane's ledgers. Children feared neither of them. On the 20th anniversary of the courthouse wedding, the town held a supper at the ranch. Silas Bell brought apple preserves. Judge Carroll, retired and nearly blind, sat near the stove. Even Orrin Phelps came, though he remained careful in his choice of words. When the meal ended, Jane noticed something above the kitchen window. Miles had built a narrow shelf. On it sat the carved wooden wren, its wings worn smooth, its small beak still pale from the touch of her fingers. Beside it rested 7 tiny pieces of rawhide, gathered over the years from the lantern, the bucket, the mare's old tack, and the places where Jane had used them to mark something hurt and tended. Miles had mounted them in a simple wooden frame. Beneath them he had carved 7 words. They left, she stayed, he chose home. Jane read the words twice. "You found every piece," she said. He kept looking. She leaned against him. Outside, sunset spread copper light over the repaired fences. Coffee waited on the stove. Lottie's children slept beneath quilts upstairs. Abel argued cheerfully with a ranch hand near the barn. The 3-legged dog, now old and gray, rested beneath the table. The house knew Jane meant to stay. So did Miles, and that is how Bitter Creek remembered them. Not as the unwanted woman and the feared cowboy, not as 2 wounded people joined by debt, but as the pair who taught a whole town that being chosen is not the same as being rescued. Sometimes it is simply this: when every easy person walks away, someone sees the weight you carry, steps beside you before the watching world, and says without shame that your burdens belong at their table. Then one day you look around and discover they were never only burdens. They were the boards, nails, bread, scars, and faithful hands from which a home was made.